Okay, well, I might kick off. We've got a few people still trickling in, but let's start so we can have a good, full conversation. So thanks for joining us. So for those who don't know me, I'm Brett Gale. I'm the Executive Director of the Chifley Research Centre. I'd like to start by acknowledging that where I am currently zooming in from is the Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and I want to pay my respects to elders past and present. And I'd like to acknowledge that wherever you are, that you're on Indigenous land that's never been ceded as well. So welcome to this, the third in our series of Chifley Conversations. It's good to see some people who've been with us at other occasions back, and I hope you enjoyed tonight as much as we've had fun in the others. So one of the objectives of these Chifley Conversations really is to look beyond the immediate needs of the coronavirus crisis and towards the sort of social democratic future that all of us would like to see created. And that's why I'm particularly excited with the event we're having tonight. Because social democracy has always relied upon the population having confidence in the idea that the state can be a force for good and that policies enacted by governments will create lasting benefit for society at large. But unfortunately, for most of the past 40 years, there's been a sustained attack on this very notion that lies at the heart of social democracy. And prior to the current crisis, trust in our politicians and trust in government more generally were at all-time lows. So while the response to the coronavirus has seen major government intervention in all aspects of our lives, the crisis itself has highlighted what a fragile position many aspects of Australian life were already in before the crisis. But we can't take for granted that we are automatically on a path to a social democratic future. We need to fight for it. And to fight for it, we can look to our history. Under the Prime Minister, whom this centre is named for, Ben Chifley, planning for post-war reconstruction began during World War II. That's why now is the time to plan for our post-COVID community and economic recovery, one which will form the basis of a renewed social compact that strengthens our social democracy. And that's really what we're about to talk about tonight. And so tonight we're joined for this conversation by three great friends of the Chifley Research Centre and three of the most interesting and exciting thinkers about the future of social democracy that I know. And they're all top people to boot. So we're joined by Badham, author and Guardian columnist, Andrew Giles, who's a member for Scullin, Shadow Minister for Cities and Urban Infrastructure, and Shadow Minister for Multicultural Affairs. Now, Andrew, along with Ryan Batchelor, has written a couple of great pieces in recent months for Chifley on where Labor's future lies and where social democracy lies. And finally, but not last, we've got Marc Stears, a former advisor and speechwriter to UK Labor and director of the Sydney Policy Lab at the University of Sydney. So welcome to all three of you, and welcome to everybody else for joining us. And it's great to see so many people with their cameras on, so we can see smiling faces and know that we're having a really live interactive discussion with actual people. So thanks for doing that. And as more people join, please do turn your cameras on. A couple of ground rules. We are filming this to upload. So, be careful of what you're doing in your background while we're doing that, because we will upload to social media. And likewise, feel free to use the chat for all questions or opinions. And please stay polite, obviously, in the chat, but we will be drawing out questions from the chat as we go. So with that, I might kick off with a question to all three of you, but I'll start with Van to answer it. So basically, COVID-19, we've seen sort of unprecedented policy making from governments, any type of government, let alone a conservative one. I mean, there are too many numerous examples to mention, but you don't need to look no further than wage subsidies that the government is actually supporting people's wages through this. And I see a lot of social democrats online acting as if this renewed role for government is a permanent part of our state of affairs. I mean, I think if anyone heard Josh Frydenberg at the press club today, they might be rethinking that. But anyway, I have seen people do that. So I guess to paraphrase Nixon, are we all Keynesians now? Are we all social democrats now? And has COVID-19 and the responses to it caused a permanent shift in attitudes to the role of government? Van, I'll start with you.
Well, I think everybody's a social democrat in a crisis, and COVID-19 has really brought out the need for the tendencies that social democracy represents, which is a strong, resilient state, which is capable of adapting production, distribution and exchange in order to meet contingencies and changing demand. Obviously the need for extremely robust social welfare systems and social services like schools and hospitals, and a public service which is large and can manage crises in a multi-directional and intersectional way. I also think that, you know, traditional social democratic provisions around the five giants, you know, an adequate amount of support for people who are unemployed, an adequate pension, education, a built environment, and health provision. All of these things are the traditional standards of what social democracy is. And it's those standards that we've come to rely on over the course of this crisis. You know, a hero is a person who keeps somebody alive. And certainly we're looking at a heroic service of the community by the systems that we have and this sort of rapid adjustment that we've been able to do. I think everybody who is on the left of politics is looking at it as an opportunity, as the way the Second World War was, to remake an economy. Looking at these unprecedented changes that we've had to adapt to really quickly is, you know, chaos is a ladder, and this is a ladder for us to re-articulate why these social systems that we've hung on to for dear life after 40 years of neoliberalism are really important to us. And certainly if we look at the number of Australians who are currently dependent on government welfare, that's really changing the neoliberal narrative around what welfare is and what it's for. I mean, we have had 40 years of being told that anybody who is on the dole is a bludger and just lacks the gumption to go out and get work. We've been fed propaganda in lieu of a reality that jobs just don't exist in parts of the economy. And now that this crisis has taken place, I think we'll find a lot of people who find themselves in those dole queues, not through any fault of their own, because it's never through fault of people's own, looking at their relationship with the state and survival, the workplace, unemployment in a much more critical way. That's not to say that we can't manage to kick over the ladder if we get clumsy about it, but certainly we're at an opportunity to have a discussion about why the things that we fight for as a broad left movement are really important for our ongoing survival.
Andrew?
Yeah, look, I might just start where Van did. I mean, we're all social democrats in a crisis, but I think the challenge for us is to make sure that that sense of collectivism is not just a response to circumstances. The observation that I'd like to start with is crises expose structural weaknesses, and I think that's what we've seen. A lot of Australians have understood how important their relationship is to the state through this process. And the challenge is going to be to maintain that connection. And I think that's the really important conversation we've got to lead through this discussion and through the work of federal Labor and those on the broad left, to make sure that the inequalities that have been so dramatically exposed through the experience of lockdown and so many people losing access to employment, access to income, that we don't bake those in a recovery. And we start the conversation now about the sort of country we want to live in. And in doing so, we recognise that economic inequality is very, very closely related to political inequality. So we need to lean on trust in government. And it was fantastic timing, Brett, and I presume you organised this, that the Australia Institute put together its polling on trust in government around a number of economies, including Australia. And what we've seen through this is a massive upswing in people's reliance in government to fix the problems in their lives. We've got to make sure, again, this isn't just a temporary thing, that we can use this experience, people's lived experience of crisis, to build a greater sense of solidarity and hope through government as we exit the crisis into the recovery phase.
That's a great point. So just building off what Andrew and Van have said, Marc, you know, for 40 years, people are beginning to now reconnect to government and understand what it means. But for 40 years, sort of the right has demonised this concept of government. But I might say with help from the centre left. You know, we've been the ones that have privatised. We've been the ones that have outsourced. We've been the ones that have bought into this paradigm. And, you know, who can forget, even though it's almost 30 years old now, Bill Clinton saying the era of government is over, right? These are champions of the centre left that did that. So how do we begin building on this crisis, but how do we turn that around, that 40 years of demonisation of the role of government? Daniel, can you unmute Marc?
Thank you very much. And thanks everyone. So wonderful to see so many faces. I mean, I want to go to the heart of that question, I think resides actually in what is it that we want government to do? And one of the things that people have stopped asking government to do over that 40-year period that you described, Brett, is tackle inequality. Inequality is the thing which has driven the vast social changes that we've seen in almost all advanced democracies in the last 30 or 40 years. And, you know, governments of both of the left and the right have basically said it's okay. You know, inequality is the price we pay for economic growth, or the price we pay for innovation and creativity. And I think even in this moment, we on the left have yet to find the courage to say, no, inequality is not only a grave evil, but it undermines the functioning of our society. Unequal economies are less productive, are less creative, are less dynamic. And then I think it goes to the heart of the issue that you've raised, is I don't think, I'm going to be a bit controversial here, but I don't think we're being courageous enough in this moment. We're all saying, oh, isn't it fantastic that the Morrison government has taken us through the, you know, the JobKeeper and, you know, government interventions in public health. And of course, those are admirable actions, but we haven't yet seen the government say, actually, inequality is the thing that we need to tackle and confront. You know, we haven't even seen many people on the Labour side say that's where we really need to inject some energy in this transformation. You know, this lockdown, we keep being told on the TV, we're all in it together. We're not all in it together. You know, if you are a young migrant, you're not all in this together. You've been abandoned without any financial support. If you're facing domestic violence at home, you're not there. If you're disabled, dependent on services which have been stopped, you're not there. So I think in order to get the courage back to call for more government action, we have to find our moral centre, and our moral centre is saying an unequal society is an unjust society, and that's what we should be in politics to stop.
Hear, hear.
Excellent, excellent. So, so just building on that, so what do you think are the driving forces that have been driving that distrust in government over the last 40 years and the distrust in politicians? I'll start with you, Marc.
Thank you. I mean, I think there are two things essentially. I mean, one of which is age-old argument, but I think it's true, that politics became more of a professional managerial game, if you like, over that period in time. And people became less and less clear that, you know, political leaders, you know, elite politicians were actually part and parcel of their daily lives and routines. So to get a bit academic, I'm in a university after all. There's an amazing scholar who's now passed away, sadly, but called Peter Mayer. And he wrote a book called Ruling the Void. And in Ruling the Void, he argues that in the 30, 40, 50 years ago, if you were walking down the street, you could feel, there you are, Brett's got it there. You could feel as if you were in direct touch with your local member of parliament. They would be a member of your local trade union branch, or, you know, some other organization that you were part of. And over the course of the last few decades, that separation has been created, where people feel, sometimes fairly, sometimes unfairly, that politicians are more comfortable with each other than they are with the rest of us, the rest of the population. And actually the dividing lines between Labour and Liberal and National and everybody else doesn't really matter as much as it used to in the old days. So I think the fundamental connection or reconnection we need to see from our politics is actually a connection between broader society and those people who are professional politicians. Some, of course, do this brilliantly already. It's unfair. I think Peter accuses too many politicians of falling into that trap. But it is, I think, you know, there has been an increasing number of people who see politics as a career rather than as a vocation which connects them to the communities they claim to represent. And that's where I would start the change.
Andrew, as a professional politician?
Look, I'd start actually where Marc started. Again, like, I think what we have not been good at, I think, on the centre-left around the developed world for the last 30 years at least, is to inject a sense of moral purpose. And I think that's what's been missing. You know, we have been very technocratic, and we've relied on technocratic arguments rather than arguments that pitch to our shared values. And I guess that's one of the reasons why, when I think about the role of government, when I think about this conversation, I think about it in terms of a social compact. I think it, you know, as Chifley obviously did immediately after the war, the things that are both material and not material that bind us together in a community. And I think they are easier things to build human connection to than the more transactional approach to politics. Now, that's always going to be part of it, particularly in terms of building a safety net that works for everyone. But I think we have often got distracted by the detail of policy implementation and focused on that technocratic task to the cost of building a powerful story about a better future for people. I think that is the overall issue. Now, I guess in terms of how politicians are and how politicians are seen, I think that's changed enormously. The one thing that I think is really interesting though, is that by and large, if you ask people whether they like and have regard for their local member, they tend to say yes, regardless of who she or he is. When you ask them about politicians generally, they give a very, very different answer. And I think that comes down to the gap between people's hopes and aspirations for their life, the life of their family, their friends, and how they see politics being played out, how it's being transacted. And I think that's a big part of the problem that we have to confront. And again, I don't have all the answers. If I did, I wouldn't have shadow in my title for a start. But I think it's having a persuasive, purposive and moral story that speaks to people's hopes, dreams and fears, I think has got to be part of the answer.
So Van, you're a storyteller by trade, and you're one of the great communicators on the left. And Andrew's just touched on the need for purposive stories. But before I go to that, I'd like to get Alan Chenoweth, who has a question about communicating and how we on the left can communicate better, out of the chat, because I think it's right up your alley.
I love it. What's the question? Hi.
Hey, thank you. It's wonderful to see so many people participating. One of the issues that we've got, and we are part of a couple of groups that are making submissions to the Queensland government and others, is that I feel that those who are pushing for things to snap back to normal as quickly as possible after the crisis, they are all speaking with one voice. Let's get back to normal. Whereas all the different groups who are agitating or putting in submissions saying, no, we want things to change, they are speaking with 1,000 different voices. I think that one of the first hurdles to overcome with a government who might be seeking direction is firstly get to the point where we all agree that things have to change. How can we, across the left-right divide, come to a point where we all agree there's got to be some changes made to the relationship between government and society coming out of this crisis?
Well, I think the way that you do it, and certainly the way that the neoliberals ran their project, was by creating a cultural hegemony. And that's a huge and long-term project that involves participation beyond what we consider to be the officially political. So people understand the sort of historical moment that we've inherited. After the Second World War, the Western democracies knew that the enemy was communism, and the way to stop, a revolutionary insurgent working class was to build very strong social democratic states as a matter of survival. Like, the West had to beat the competition often to the working class of the Soviet model and promote its distinctions as well as buttress its potential for equalities. So you saw the rise of the New Jerusalem and these massive welfare states. And in Australia, what I think is the crowning achievement of Labor Party policy, which was the full employment policy pushed by Curtin and Chifley with the White Paper in 1945, that said, if you are Australian, you get a job, the government creates a job for you, we will build massive infrastructure projects that enhance national productivity, and there is a role for you in this economy and there is potential for you in this society, which became a project that, of course, expanded into Labor's campaigns for public health, for greater educational opportunity, free education in the 1970s, all of these things. It was a cumulative project. At the same time, what became the organised neoliberal movement was pursuing its own strategy of pulling apart the state that was being created, and instead pushing the program of decentralised, privatised, individualised social experience. And they started planning that literally at the end of the Second World War. Friedrich von Hayek was having meetings with journalists and historians academics, intellectuals, economists throughout the world, actually coordinating the sharing of cultural campaigning information across a network of think tanks across the West, across the United States, across Australia, across England, and obviously Western Europe. And they pursued that project for 40 years, waiting for the opportunity to deliver monetarism and neoliberalism and free market orthodoxy as the solution to economic problems. They used the oil crisis of the 1970s, when all of a sudden there was explosion in oil prices, which was unprecedented, and suddenly full employment wasn't working because the economies couldn't catch up to this massive disruption to economics that had come from the oil crisis. And I think the centre left entered a moment of total panic because it hadn't been dealing with these kind of economic factors like stagflation before. And I think that there is an enormous amount of economic insecurity on the left, that somehow, because we are from a working class background and a working class frame of mind, that we don't understand how to run economies in the way that business people or orthodox establishment figures that are generally on the right do. And it's a matter of history that centre-left governments in America, in the UK, in Europe, in Australia, drank the Kool-Aid that the monetarists were offering, that privatisation, monetarism were the solution to the problems in the 1970s. Certainly, when Hawke and Keating, one of the very rarely discussed aspects of the Hawke and Keating era is they inherited a treasury that had absolutely been cut to pieces by Malcolm Fraser. Malcolm Fraser's great political legacy of this country was actually what he did to the public service with his razor gang, ensuring that when Labor took over, universally the advice that they were getting from Treasury was monetarism, was neoliberalism, privatisation, all of those things. They didn't come out of a void. It wasn't something that Keating just came up with. There was a context of official advice at the time. Meanwhile, the neoliberals were running a vast cultural project. They toured Milton Friedman out here in the 1970s like a pop star. They put him on TV. They created a cult of celebrity around him. The 200 richest companies in Australia were handing out copies of IPA and Centre for Independent Study magazines. There were children's books. The game Polyeconomy, which is it's like Monopoly, it was designed by neoliberals to teach children the values of neoliberalism. They created an orthodoxy within the culture that these were the economic answers to the time. And part of the project that the centre-left have to embrace is that we actually have to engage with politics beyond politics, that it's not just an electoral project, it's not just an economic project, it's about engaging people where they are at, the places where people are gathering, in their workplaces, in their homes, in their places of social interaction, and actually being responding to the culture and creating objects of education, information, ideological value that people can understand in the places where those people can understand them. And that's what we have not been doing. We've been telling great stories about liberalism through media, through novels, through films, through television stories that are about the great triumphs of the free individual. We're very good at communicating those values, but the values of collectivism, sharing, the state, infrastructure, employment, those are the great themes of our project that we haven't been discussing, and that's what we have to reclaim.
Annie in the chat has mentioned that, and I might throw to her for a question, because she's also talked about the fact that most of our time we seem to be talking about the economy rather than people. So Annie.
Oh, thank you. Hello, everyone. Well, I have had time to think a little bit about this. I don't know much depth, but I've always thought if we put people first, then whatever follows will follow. So if we place people in the centre of our economic thinking as opposed to making profits or whatever it is the government is thinking at the time, I think we can do a bit better than what we've been doing so far.
Andrew?
Yeah, well, I think Anthony Albanese would be very pleased to hear you say that, Annie, because in really every contribution he's made about what the future looks like, he's been using words like that, talking about building an economy that serves people's interests, not the other way around. And I think for us, being able to tell that story really rests on, I guess, rolling back some of the themes that Van has spoken so eloquently and effectively about. I'd just add one other thing, because I think it's really critical that we do talk about our challenge of faith in government, building a better future in terms of it serving the interests of people here. But I think we've also got to get the balance right. When we look to the past, it's got to be for inspiration for the future, not to think that we can somehow build a better yesterday tomorrow. Because I think that has been a challenge for the centre-left around the world for the last 20 or 30 years. We're quite good at talking about some of the things that we've done. We haven't been so persuasive in talking about the things that we are going to do.
Marc, what's your take on
Yeah, I mean, I love that last point, and I thought that came across really powerfully, Van's sort of account of neoliberalism too. It's that, you know, the driving energy and excitement of building something new, that gives people so much passion, so much reason to get involved, in the sense that, you know, it's just not going to be the same as it is now, but neither are we going to go back to the past. That's an impossibility. But we're going to use our imagination, our creativity, you know, and we're going to work really hard to create a different future. And I think, you know, again, we've said it before, is we've probably not spent enough time fleshing out what that different future should be, you know, giving it some real shape. Occasionally, I think we do hide behind abstractions too much, or even I do that. You know, you talk about inequality or you talk about government, which, you know, these are words which mean things to people like us who talk about politics all the time, but they're not tangible enough for, you know, for people who get on with their normal lives. You know, they want a better future, but they really got to give them some account of what that better future looks like that they can identify with. And I think even more important than that, you've got to make people active participants in the process of building that future. I mean, I think one of the reasons that people have turned off politics is they always think, you know, we're offering, like Superman style, we're flying to the rescue with a plan, and they've just got to sign up to the plan and everything's going to get better. And nobody believes that. You know, it's like, we're not superheroes. Politicians aren't superheroes. They are, in fact, people who can work with others to create, you know, a different kind of future for us all. And that ability to go out and to listen to people whose voices aren't usually heard, to help them think about what a better future would be, and to help them see that they have a part themselves in creating that, that's, I think, where the real tangible excitement lies. And if I might just give one practical example of that, you know, I was lucky enough to work with David Axelrod when I was at UK Labour, who was the campaign manager for Barack Obama in the 2 presidential campaigns that Obama won. And Axelrod had this fantastic line that he used to share. Every time he'd look at a draft speech, he'd say, this is literally what he'd say. He'd say, you've got your underpants over your trousers. By which he meant, you're pretending you're a superhero. Like, you know, nobody believes you're a superhero. Like, just tell them what you want to try and do and what they need to do in order to help you get there. And that kind of mission, I just think, is so much more exciting, palpably exciting, than some of the more, as you know, Andrew and Van have said, technocratic, stale, dry ways that we often do our politics.
Andrew, one of the things you've written about for Chifley is you've called for a new social compact for Australia. And I think it builds on what the 3 of you have just said. So I'll put the question to all 3 of you, but I'll start with you. I mean, what elements do you think would make up a new social compact for Australia?
Well, I think they come into a couple of categories, and I'm really interested in the debate that people like Tim South-Pomasan have embarked upon about claiming citizenship as a progressive form of patriotism. Because what I think about when I think about a social compact is the things that we can lean on each other as fellow citizens with. The most obvious one that, you know, is Labor's core story, I think, is Medicare. Medicare as safety net, Medicare as social wage, Medicare as a moral statement that we shouldn't let people fall behind. I think our ingrained sense of justice in the labour market, which obviously has been deeply, deeply threatened by 40 years of neoliberalism, is a core part of it, and finding ways to re-articulate that and to support unions in their work in workplaces is another critical part of that social compact. And Annie, if I can borrow your contribution, a really fundamental way of conveying a sense of a world where it's the people who work who are at the centre of our economic and societal challenge. And then there's a big bit about hope and a word that is sometimes a sort of dirty word in left and centre-left politics, but aspiration, a sense of a society that offers opportunities to everyone, that recognises that we don't all start in the same place, and is committed to offering everyone every opportunity to fill their potential, whether it's through access to early learning, through lifelong learning, through recognising and removing the barriers to economic participation. I think that's got to be a part of the story about a sort of enduring social compact that's forward-looking for Australia. Sorry, that I could probably go on for the rest of the Zoom, so I'll stop at this point and let the others fill in some gaps, hopefully.
So Van, your view of what a new social compact for Australia would look like?
Well, I think that the pitch we make has got to be movement wide. I mean, one of my great frustrations, and one of the reasons why we've talked about how you used to see your local member in your community and feel that they were one of you, specifically if they were a Labor person, you know, they were you had come through the movements with them. We don't have much sense of being an integrated movement. Like in terms of looking at the Labor project, there's the party project, which is the electoral project, there's the union project, and they're not intersectional systems with a broader social experience anymore. And that's happened for all kinds of reasons, because of changes to the workplace, because we have decentralised work, because of attacks on the public service, because of the, in many ways, necessary professionalisation of the political class. I mean, let's face it, you know, politicians have to deal with more stuff than they ever have had to before, as anyone who's ever watched a Donald Trump science briefing knows all too well. But what we've lost a connection to a broader means of including the culture in the project. And it was a sense of frustration because I, as a young person, wandered away from the Labor Party that I had grown up with and, you know, went on my horrible trotty bench for a few years. And I do apologise quite publicly for that, how shameful. But one of the reasons was I did not feel that I, as a creative person, as a person who was a theatre maker and, you know, worked in alternative media and was a rock critic, I didn't see there was a role for me in the project, in building the New Jerusalem or the New Jerusalem, that I didn't have a contribution to make outside of a very narrow political experience. And I think if we're looking at the opportunity of COVID-19, it's to talk about a movement that builds a future for everybody, that builds a future that can cope with anything. And that future of resilience, of dealing with climate change, of dealing with pandemics, of dealing with what is suddenly a very unpredictable world all over again, is one that actually requires the participation of everybody. There is a huge role for health professionals in the policy of a future that can cope with anything. There is a huge role for artists who are creating the entertainment, education products that can cope with everything. There is a role for educators. All of these things, there are opportunities for us to be part of that shared vision. How do we actually, given the fact we're all sitting at home doing Zoom meetings, and I'll admit this for the sake of political progress, in my Ugg boots consistently, this is an opportunity for looking at crisis adaptation as a blueprint for a better resilience of which everyone can be a part. And that, I think, that's the launch, and that's the promise we can make to people. Trust has fallen away from politics, not only because of that desocialization of politicians with their communities, but also because we've been inundated with marketing slogans that we know are marketing slogans that are not relevant to our experience. They're just like brand competitions. And we know that, you know, we get Malcolm Turnbull promising jobs and growth infamously, which didn't lead to jobs and didn't lead to growth. We're on the precipice of enormous economic problems with some of the worst unemployment we've had in living memory. Like these empty slogans don't actually lead to outcomes that people feel that they will get from investing in that process. And obviously that creates a lack of trust. We are still in the centre-left dealing with the fact the Soviet project was an absolute disaster, and the things we learned about Sovietism destroyed our language of socialism, collectivization, and so many of those words were ruined because the impact of the Cold War was devastating on like the grand vision of the big socialist left-wing project. And we're also dealing with the fact that the promise of social democracy, which was that adapting neoliberal mechanisms would lead to great wealth and prosperity, also lead to offshoring, privatization, job loss, all of those things. On our side, we've taken some really heavy brand damage in the two different areas of the ideology that we represent. But I do think that opportunity for broad movement building around a shared project of which everyone can make make service and make contribution, that is the opportunity that we should be looking at now, and in that language, because I think everybody's terrified about the future. No one really believes there's going to be a snapback. Like, that's not going to happen. We live in a world where pandemics we've been told are almost inevitable, and that insecurity is actually our opportunity for saying we can be more resilient.
Marc, what's your views on
again, just build that. I think that thought about the energy of the movement building piece, I think, is absolutely spot on right. And it takes me back to the inequality theme that I started with, I think, which is that for me, I think many of us on the left are comfortable about talking about economic inequalities. You know, we have done that, and in the last general election campaign, Labour had a good program of policies to put right some deep economic inequalities in Australia, and that's great, and that should carry on. But there are other inequalities too that we probably haven't spoken about enough, and one of them, I think, is inequality of power. Most people in this country feel as if their voice doesn't matter, that they can have opinions about all kinds of things, but they don't get to make decisions. That politicians of either side don't listen to them, big business leaders certainly don't, the press is not interested in them. And I think this COVID-19 experience will have deepened that sense, actually, that on the one hand, people are glad that the government has helped us through the public health crisis, but so many people have had experiences that they haven't been able to share, which are deeply worrying experiences. I mean, I saw some polling from the UK yesterday, which said that over 50% of the population feel as if their mental health is in real danger, that they're feeling depression and anxiety, and that they feel as if the government has no plan for what to do about that. So my passion, I think, coming out of this process is just, let's say we need to tackle inequality. That's the sort of cancer at the heart of our society. But it's not just anymore about redistributing a bit of income. You're making welfare benefits more generous, which of course we should do, getting wages up. We should do that. But it's actually a more transformative challenge, is that you need to give people the sense again that their voice and their opinion should be driving change in our country. And Van's description of that, I think, is just perfect. This sense of, let's build this more resilient future, but let's do it together, and let's do it piece by piece in a way which actually identifies that the real creativity in a country like this resides in people's living rooms and people's communities, and not necessarily in the big places which we currently look for.
Thanks. We've got Jed Carney with us, another great Labor member, and Jed had some also great points in the chat to make about this. So, hi Jed, how are you doing down there in Melbourne?
Oh, I'm doing really well. I didn't expect you to go to me. I just, well, I'm going really well. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. I was just noticing what you were saying about some of the things that you think are needed in a new social compact.
I think it goes back to what the title of this whole session is, and that is the role of government. And I think we reach in a new social compact. We have to say what Dan and Marc and Andrew are saying is that we need government as an interventionist thing, an interventionist being. And if we're going to look at real new social policy in the future and realising our public service, we need to make sure that our social services are actually properly resourced and funded, and that people can rely on them. It's a bit of Maslow's theory. I see in the chat everyone saying we've got to revitalise democracy, but if you're not going to worry about democracy if you're worrying about how you're going to eat your next meal. If you've got a job and you're assured that if you're sick you're going to be looked after, your kids are going to get a good education. I think we really have to start building up again that whole narrative around the role of government, and Van said it so beautifully before. I'm a big fan for a full employment policy. I love the curtain Chifley Coombs white paper concept. And I think it's something that can be done in a modern economy. And all of that, though, people are going to say, oh, it's going to cost too much. And yeah, it will cost money. But we've got to do away with this whole fear of debt. I mean, we are crippled by this concept of a government going into debt. And I don't know how you get over that, because I saw someone on the chat saying that the right to scream from the back of the bar the whole time. One of the things they do scream is, massive austerity response from this government, and it's going to drive us into the ground, and we're never ever going to really get a chance to drive the whole concept of big government and a social democratic state. Is going to be very difficult. So we have to start now. And I just love what everyone's saying. I agree with Marc and Dan and Andrew. It's been a great conversation. Thank you very much.
But this is what you're saying, Jed, about the need for full employment, I think is absolutely crucial to the broader centre-left project as well, because we learnt how to be the left by having government jobs. We learnt how to be the left by our workplaces being sites of our service to community. And because of the neoliberal orthodoxy, it's like we've been terrified of directly creating government jobs, not only as public servants for the bureaucracy, but in public works, and directly employing through public works, and directly employing through expansion of services. When we outsource, we actually hobble our own project, because we de-skill and de-educate people in what it means to be part of a service-based political collective. If we are to survive as a movement that believes in integration and collectivism, sharing and the state, and the role of the state improving people's lives, we actually have to train people on the job about what it means to collectively be part of that state. And that's why full employment is so absolutely important to our project of change and opportunity going forward.
So I agree with you, Dan. And the concept of full... No, thank you. That's good. I agree.
So we've touched a little bit on what the Liberals might do, and there's been a lot of talk about snapback and those sort of words, and going back to a neoliberal future. But Osman Chu in the chat had an interesting view on this, and I might just throw it up now.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. I guess I've sort of been in a lot of these Zoom meetings and reading a lot, and there's been a lot of discussion about, what kind of social democratic future we can have. And it just takes me back to, when the global financial crisis happened, and there was all this discussion about how it discredited neoliberalism. And I sort of fear that we sort of have this assumption that it will mean a social democratic future. Because I think people have touched on it could result in a revived neoliberal austerity, with the government trying to finish off the 2014 austerity budget. But I also think that a big state national conservatism is also possible. That's corporatist, more authoritarian, sort of framing itself as protecting us from threats that incorporate industry policy and full employment and geopolitical confrontation with China. I mean, you look at the Republican Party, and there are senators and thinkers actually setting out that frame. So I think that's also a threat that we actually have to think. The threat isn't just neoliberalism, but this sort of right-wing populist conservatism that's happy to ditch the free markets.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. Who would like to respond to that? I think, that's the Boris Johnson narrative as well as the Trump narrative, that our politics haven't gone down. But if they certainly do, where does that leave Labor as the, defenders of open borders, cosmopolitanism, free marketism?
Totally.
Yeah, well, Brett, I might jump in briefly. I think that's a really critical question, because I think we face three futures. One is neoliberalism red in tooth and claw and austerity on the way out. And you just have to pick up the Financial Review any day, which tells us that the answer to every problem in Australia, except perhaps finding a vaccine, is deregulating the labour market more and cutting company taxes. So that's a very powerful voice that's already emerging in the snapback context. But I do think Scott Morrison has got a lot in common with the Boris Johnson. I think we do see an element in Australia of this big state conservatism with leanings towards authoritarianism. And I think that's another future that we have to expose whilst making our case for rejection of austerity, for a future that is premised on full employment, as Jed and Van were talking about. And I think fundamentally, which rebalances power from those citizens who have felt completely powerless. And the one way I think we can do that is through a deeper understanding of the power of the state to resist those forces that have made people's lives feel so lacking in choice and so lacking in hope. But that'd be my opening salvo.
Marc or Van?
Yeah, if I could just leap in, I think that's a brilliant, that three futures map is a really brilliant way of thinking about it. I mean, I really want to stress how dangerous I think this authoritarian conservatism might be in the immediate post-pandemic period. Just a couple of reflections. I mean, first, the popularity of border closures in Australia is remarkable. I mean, so we all think, you know, it's fabulous that the curve has been flattened as it has been, and of course it is. And we all think that border closures have played an important part in flattening it, which of course they have. But then very, very few people have sat back and said, okay, so what does this mean about the future of Australia as a global country, as a country which is open to migration and to the influences of the rest of the world? And you can very quickly see how this becomes a dangerous argument very fast, which is you blame the virus on a foreign country. You congratulate ourselves on being able to prevent the virus by being rigorous in our control of migration. And then you make that a catch-all argument. So the economy then becomes an argument about migration as well. And before you know it, cultural conservatism becomes the dominant kind of part, dominant rhetorical device in our politics. And we just have to be honest, I think that works very well for the right. It works very badly for the left. You can't compete in those terms and expect to beat the Liberals or the Nationals. That cultural conservatism tied to nativism and nationalism is a rhetorical device which enables the right to win power. Boris Johnson is a version of that. Donald Trump is another version of that. Peter Dutton, of course, is our kind of local version of that. And we need, I think, to think very, very fast strategically about how we're going to respond to that, because that argument is coming. It's going to be coming in 6 months' time, if not before that. And so that's the first thing. I think the second thing, just if I may very briefly, that there is also, though, unfortunately, as everyone has said, strength left in neoliberalism. And you see this again, sorry to use another British example, but 27 million people in Britain are currently dependent on the state for their wages, either through furlough schemes or through social welfare schemes. That's more people than there are in the whole of Australia. It's a third of the population, essentially. Now, these people are extremely vulnerable to what happens next. If there is a return to austerity or to neoliberalism, it's a disaster for a large number of those people. But you can see from the governing party's point of view, from the Conservative Party in the UK, it's very tempting to cut those people loose because it costs an awful lot of money daily to keep those people, with their heads above water. So there are backbench Conservative MPs in Britain now saying you need radical austerity very quickly because the pandemic has been so costly. And we saw that in the press club today from the Treasurer, that very same argument, which is how many $1 billion does it cost per week to keep the country afloat during pandemic. So the reason I'm getting a little bit irate in my voice is that I just think that the right has got two very strong arguments coming our way. Cultural nationalism on the one hand, and a need to make radical cutbacks to pay the price of the pandemic on the other. And we've really got to be ready to have strong counter arguments to those claims.
Yeah, and
I also think, sorry, Dan, before I flick to you, I also wonder whether part of the rush for the right wing to get people back to work and economies reopen is that they don't want people to understand that there is actually a different world out there, that we can change the way we work permanently, that we can actually, increase the social safety net and do all these sorts of things. But Van, what's your view on this whole, social nationalism versus austerity, or the worst, the co-joining of these two devils?
Oh, look, I think Marc is right. And I think that what we are unbelievably bad at doing on the left is claiming claiming the language of pride in being Australian. I think we're almost terrified of using the word Australian, as if a very small minority of crazy trots on the internet will automatically denounce anybody who expresses pride in an Australian identity as being some kind of, you know, genocidal racist. My notion of what it means to be Australian is to be cosmopolitan, is to be multicultural, is to be, you know, a country of new arrivals building a shared project of opportunity that has been denied elsewhere. I think what we have to find is a language of national pride that is not nationalistic. And it's discursively tricky, but it's really important. Interestingly, it was something that Curtin did in order to shepherd his great economic reforms through, was attach them to a project of patriotism and a sense of community and shared identity and the status that comes from that. One of the things that came out, and a lot of the post-election polling was looking at the way that swing voters in particular connect to stories of national identity and what that means and who represents that pride in being a member of the community and who looks like them in terms of a cultural experience based around Australian values. That isn't a racist paradigm to the vast majority of people, because the vast majority of people don't live in monocultural communities in this country. They don't want to. We don't want to be monocultural here. That's not who we are. That's not where our strength or our, you know, our cultural activity or energy comes from. But certainly we have to start communicating in terms of the Australia that we want to build, an Australian project of shared values, shared achievement, shared status, shared cultural recognition that brings in people who want to express that pride and sense of identity in terms of a meaningful project. And it's going to be tricky to do. The willingness of the right to wrap themselves in the flag and sing the songs and punish the 10-year-old girl who doesn't want to sing the national anthem, like they're ready to do that. They have great eagerness to actually adopt the symbols of local identity, of being their own. And I think the Republicans have done that unbelievably well in the United States. The fact that American flags are associated with the Trump project, I think, is terrifying. And I think obviously Brexit is the revelation that a sense of national identity and community and local identity was absolutely, like, that's what the Brexit project was about. It was about co-opting the symbols of community in order for the leadership of that particular campaign to you know, anoint themselves the national character. And I think if we're talking about the future and Australian visions and Australian opportunity, you know, that has to be imbued with a love of community, and we can't be afraid of expressing it in those terms. It is a wonderful opportunity to be Australian. I come from a migrant background like everybody else who is not Indigenous, and the opportunity of my family here was transformative. And I think connecting to that sense of potential, opportunity, pride, that is absolutely crucial to the articulation of a vision that heads off the authoritarian nationalism, is that articulating an Australian identity which is about collectivism and group project is actually more powerful than an Australian identity in which a few people tell you what you can and can't do. And that's the option of the right.
Thank you. I also think that, you know, one of the things we need to get back to is really pride in public service and pride in government. I mean, you've talked there about pride in the nation, Ben. I think that's a really good point for how we fight back against that chauvinistic nationalism. Claire Mullen, I know in the chat, and this might be probably the last question before I come back, had a point about reinvigorating, you know, what the public service does, and how we support that public service. So I might just get Claire to ask the question.
Hi, thanks. Hi from Western Australia. Yeah, I'm a former public servant, and one of the frustrations that I've had sometimes is how the narrative around the public sector as bureaucratic and slow moving, while both true, is also not true. There are large parts of it which are agile and flexible and humanistic. And I was really interested in some comments about how do we change that narrative around the public sector. One idea I think is encouraging public servants to own the label and be talking in their families, in their communities, in their neighbourhoods. Because I imagine, and if we could get the unions involved too, in terms of really helping people understand just how dynamic the public sector can be, but there does obviously need to also be some change in how some parts of the public sector bad. So yeah, how can we change that narrative about, you know, market good, public sector bad?
Yeah. So I think that's a great way also maybe to have ending last comments, because I'm conscious that we said we'd have people here for a quick drink at 5 till 6, and then they can go off and make dinner and do whatever they do on a ISO night at home, watch Tiger King or whatever it is. So how do we build that narrative again about public service, but also build it out? How do we build that narrative that government is good? So I might start with you, Andrew, and then to Marc, and then Van for the final word.
Yeah, great question, Claire. My first Zoom of the day was actually with a group of CPSU delegates addressing exactly this question. And maybe I'll try and do a shorthand. I think one thing we need to do is to get better at allowing the full diversity of people who are Australia's public servants to tell their stories. And I think there's never going to be a better time, because more Australians than ever understand how important it is to have empathetic professional people working in Centrelink, for example, than ever before. And I think the other thing that I just want to touch on with the public service is to talk about advice. I think the scariest words uttered by a Democratic politician, and this hopefully will resonate with Marc, was when Michael Gove in the Brexit referendum said the British public have had enough with experts. I think now we really understand how vital it is to build expertise into our public service and to enable frank and fearless advice to be provided to democratic governments. I mean, you can look at the United States as a counterpoint. So I think there's never going to be a better time for us to tell these stories. I think the challenge for us as politicians and for those of us who care about building a democracy and a state that works is to give more exposure to the people who make our government work, and to allow more Australians who don't come into direct contact with their work to appreciate how significant it is, and how a great social compact will only be as good as the people who secure it.
Marc?
Yeah, I think Andrew's hit the nail right on the head there. I think that's exactly right. That what the neoliberal project managed to do was convince enough people that the public servants were just another vested interest. You know, that they were after, they're looking after themselves. They were trying to get, good pensions for themselves, good super, good wages. So they didn't really have the interests of the broader public at heart, and they needed to be broken up, and competition had to be brought in, and outsourcing. And I lived through that. That's my early adulthood, is seeing that creeping view from, when I was a kid. You used to believe that public servants had the public good at their heart. That's what they were about. And that argument became increasingly, less frequently heard, until we got to a position, I think, in the early 2000s, when everybody was saying, well, market good, government bad, because those folks in government, those people in the public service are just looking after themselves. I think now is the moment, exactly as Andrew said, to flip that argument on its head. Like, the people who are feathering their own nests at the moment are not public servants. They're business owners who are asking for subsidies whilst they don't pay enough tax. And people are beginning to recognise that the market is the area of vested interest, and the public service is the area which has the common good at its heart. And we just need to be very proudly, very clearly saying that and explaining that to people, because I do think that that's increasingly their experience. And as Van said earlier on, tackling something like outsourcing right at its heart is absolutely crucial to that. Let's not have our public services provided by private companies. Let's have them provided by the public again. And when people see that work, then we can change the whole nature of our political debate.
And Van?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think the opportunity is to call it the campaign for government jobs. And I think the infrastructure of the trade union movement is that the majority of trade union members are employed in public services and public capacities now, I believe. And certainly Labor is in a position to articulate this demand as well, that the line is public servants have nursed the sick, protected our elderly, supported people with disabilities They've taught our children, they've put out fires, they're searching for a vaccine. They've been keeping us safe, and they've been keeping us aware of what's going on through the biggest shared crisis of our lives. If public servants do this, there should be more of them. And the pitch should be to every community, if you want more government jobs in your community, tell us now. Tell us what kind of government jobs you want, because the responsibility of government should be providing services by creating jobs. And living out in regional Australia, like the idea where there's expansion of state services going on here at the moment, there's some construction going on, and there are going to be new jobs created. That is part of the economic planning of every small business, every real estate agent, every service provider in this area, because it's seen as an economic opportunity for everybody. And I think we can actually push that argument as a campaign, a direct campaign, that actually the way that we recover is by creating job opportunities for people in the public service. And if government isn't doing that, we should kick that government out. I think that's the immediate political opportunity that we have now. I think that enables us to coalesce a lot of our ideas, our principles, our values into a really like community friendly and culturally friendly campaign. And hopefully on the basis of the discussions that a lot of people are having, that's one of the ways that we can proceed forward and be the opportunity that we can use to also distinguish ourselves. You know, the social democratic movement, the socialist movement in this country, the great proud tradition of an activist broad left, is actually about material change. And it's pushing the means for that change, I think, is the opportunity for all of us now.
Thanks. That's a great way to end, Van. I think that we are in a once in a generation political cycle now at the moment. This is something fundamentally different. We talked about the GFC before, but this is something fundamentally different to that. And you know, I think the conversation we've had today is really about trying to get our side of politics, the social democratic side, thinking about how we begin to make that argument now for greater, more equitable, fairer structural change for Australia. Because if not now, when? As the saying goes. So we have to do it now. So thank you, everyone, for joining in. Thank you to Andrew, Marc, and Van for being part of it. I'm sure we could continue this conversation for many hours to come, and I'm sure that in your own environments you will. But it is, you know, a number of people have said in the chat about holding Labor politicians' feet to the fire so that we keep fighting this, about being out in our own workplaces and our own conversations having these fights. And I think that's absolutely important. I think the people who raise it in the chat, you're so right. This is a conversation we all need to keep having if we are going to change Australia for the better, to push people. So thanks, everybody. I hope you all have a safe and happy Tuesday evening. We were having a Chifley conversation next week on economic recovery. We will be putting that to the following week because the Treasurer is now making a major statement on the economy next Tuesday when Parliament's sitting. So we thought we would, rather than overshadow him, we'll shift ours to the following week. So thanks, everybody, and enjoy your evening. Bye.